is an environmental journalists of color network. The Environmental Journalists of Color Network is dedicated to advancing the careers of journalists of color who have historically been underrepresented in the field. The ultimate goal is to imbue environmental media with critical and fresh perspectives, build collective power in the space, and directly confront the inequities of racial representation in newsrooms, which, for anyone following the news about the media industry of late, has come under public scrutiny. And the network offers trainings, hosts public events like this one, and builds community as it navigates covering the environmental crises of our time. Racial injustice is the conversation right now, full stop. So we at Grist are honored to co-host this live chat between two journalists whose work on race and justice is essential. So a big thank you to Town Hall Seattle for partnering. Thank you all for joining us. And with that, please take it away, Megan from Town Hall.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and everyone at Grist. We are equally honored to be playing a role in hosting today's program. I am Megan Castillo. I'm Town Hall's program manager. Today's program will likely run about 40 minutes, followed by audience Q&A. You can view this event on Crowdcast, Facebook, or YouTube. To participate in the Q&A, submit directly using the Ask a Question button on Crowdcast. We'll try to get as many as possible. For closed captioning, YouTube has closed captions, so you can enable those by clicking on the CC button in the bottom right corner. Town Hall adds new events and podcasts every day, except this July when we'll be taking a little break. But we're finishing up this week super strong with an event with Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. Will be with us tomorrow. And on Friday, we will host a special live taping of our new podcast, Life on the Margins, this week featuring Ijeoma Oluo. While we're on hiatus, make sure to visit Town Hall's media library for hundreds of events from both the recent and pre-COVID past. Town Hall's work is made possible through the support of many generous folks. Our civic series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But as many of you know, Town Hall is foremost a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank our members watching this afternoon. Nikole Hannah-Jones is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter covering racial injustice for the New York Times Magazine and the creator of the landmark and Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 Project. In 2017, she received a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, aka the Genius Grant, for her work on education inequality as a reporter at ProPublica. Before that assignment, she worked for the Oregonian, the largest daily newspaper in the Pacific Northwest, where her beats included demographics, the census, and county government. In 2016, Hannah-Jones co-founded the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting, a training and mentorship organization geared towards increasing the number of investigative reporters of color. Brentin Mock is a staff writer for City Lab, where he writes about civil rights and matters of justice. He previously served as the justice editor at Grist and as lead reporter for Voting Rights Watch. His writing can be found on Policy Shop, The Nation, The Washington Post, and The Root. Race, justice, and journalism are the subject of this afternoon's talk. Please join me in welcoming Brentin Mock and Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Hi, we're just waiting on Brentin to accept. It'll be just a moment.
Say one more thing and you can get off.
Hello? There we go. Okay. Nikole, how are you today?
How are you going to be on CP time for your own event?
Oh, I was here, but they didn't have it on the screen. I was, but yes, I'm sorry. Thank you, Nikole, for joining us. Sorry for me being on CP time, even though I was here. It's always a complete honor to talk with you. And thank you to Grist and Seattle Town Hall for having this conversation. We got to start off by just giving you all the bow downs and all the props for the Pulitzer Prize for commentary, the National Magazine Award for podcasting, the National Magazine Award for public interest. I promise I'm not trying to make you blush. I want the haters to just like really just be in their feelings right now. The George Polk Award in journalism, all of that, all praises due. I call Nikole Rakim because she is the Rakim to media. But let's go ahead and jump in on these questions, especially this new essay that you just put out on reparations. What is owed? I don't think that we should underestimate how big of a deal this is. This is an essay on a landmark essay on reparations, coming from arguably one of the most powerful media institutions in the world. And this is the cover on the cover story for the New York Times Magazine. Another triumphant call for reparations for Black people. Nikole, talk about why it was so urgent for you to write this essay and make this call now, especially during a pandemic when economies are being wrecked and everything. I mean, it was just funny to me. It was just like, I know that y'all's economies is messed up, but we still need reparations. Why was it so urgent?
So I've been researching for a reparations essay that was going to be part of the 1619 project book expansion. There should have been an essay on reparations in the original 1619 project, because if you read the project, I don't think you can read it from front to back and not come away with a strong moral sense that a great debt is owed to Black Americans. But I wasn't planning on publishing anything right now in the middle of the pandemic. But what happened is, after George Floyd's death, and I'm watching, hundreds of thousands of Americans all across the country in all 50 states protesting against police brutality. And then I'm seeing these sudden symbolic changes occurring. I talk about some of them, that the NFL realized that Black Lives Matter, NASCAR realized that actually it's not their value to have people flying Confederate flags. All of a sudden, all of our workplaces realized that Juneteenth was a holiday that we should get off. And I was just worried that in this moment that was possibly a transformative moment, that we were asking for too little, that the least we can expect from our government is that the state can't kill citizens without consequence, but that what makes Black lives so hard is the absolute wealth poverty that almost all of us live in. And I understand that we're in the middle of a pandemic, but the Black suffering in this pandemic is something that we may likely never recover from. In fact, Black people haven't recovered from the last recession. We're the only racial group who earns less now than we did in the year 2000. More than half of Black workers, adults, are out of work right now. We have the highest rate of people who've missed a mortgage payment and a rental payment. So if we didn't deal with asking for what we really need to have equality and to make this a transformative moment, it just seemed like we would be missing out on a tremendous opportunity to push an agenda that actually could change the material interests of Black Americans. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, the pandemic has exposed a lot of things, right? It's clearly laid a magnifying glass on all of the inequalities that already existed. But one of the things we've always heard when it came to reparations is we just can't afford to do this as a country. Well, in a matter of a couple of weeks, we passed a nearly $2.3 trillion stimulus package, including $500 billion of money that has gone to businesses, including large corporations, with the federal government telling us we don't even have to tell you who got the money and how much. So it's clear that that excuse is no longer one that will hold water. So for all of those reasons, this just seemed like the time to really make the case and lay out why it is the moral and just thing to do. It's time for an economic stimulus package that will deal with the singularity of Black suffering in this country.
One of the other things that this pandemic has kind of brought out, even if maybe circumstantially, is the burden that's placed on Black journalists in terms of how we can even cover things like racial disparities, or how we can cover protests over police violence and police brutality. And this issue of objectivity and whether Black journalists can or need to or should be objective in these times has come back to the forefront. It's led to somewhat of a revolt in newsrooms across the board, and not just on the question of objectivity. It's a lot of things, as you know, but on this issue of objectivity, I want to just kind of talk about like the unique pressures that are put on Black journalists in terms of presenting themselves as quote unquote not being biased, right? I want to talk about like the different ways that white reporters and white journalists in general can show up in the newsroom and write about issues and never be accused of being biased or being objective. I have some like targeted questions on that, but I just kind of want to open up generally your thoughts about that.
So even let's be clear, the idea of objectivity is actually a fairly recent phenomenon, even in mainstream journalism. And that's not how journalism in this country started out either. But the idea of objectivity is certainly a white middle-class normative view. And it's based on the view that your identity, your experiences has no impact on how you see the world, that one can remove your feelings, remove your experiences from your coverage. And particularly when it comes to race, the thought has been that white journalists can be objective when they're covering race because white people don't really have a race. But Black people, people have always assumed they see our biases on our skin, that the presumption is, of course, we cannot be objective when we're writing about race or when we're writing about Black communities. And I've long publicly called bullshit on that, in that none of us are objective, clearly. The only thing that we're objective about are things we don't know enough about to have formed an opinion. And as soon as you become knowledgeable about anything, you have opinions and thoughts and feelings about it. And all of us in this country, no one escapes seeing their world and experiencing their world in America through a non-racialized lens. Black people have just been much more open and upfront about it. So what we're seeing in this period are Black folks really calling out and being tired of white people pretending that they're objective and that we're not, and really trying to force an acknowledgement that none of us are. I mean, every day when we see coverage of these mainstream news organizations and how they cover our communities and how they don't seem to cover our communities in ways that are accurate, we know that objectivity is a fallacy. And when you come from the Black journalistic tradition, how was one ever allowed to be objective in a country that didn't treat you as citizens, in a country that didn't believe you had the same legal rights as other Americans, in a country where your people have been brutalized often by the systems that you're covering? There is no way to be objective about that. Segregation is wrong, lynching is wrong, being second-class citizens is wrong. And so that's always the way that Black journalists have had to cover our country. We couldn't hide behind the shield of, I'm just reporting the facts. And so I think it's been really fascinating, all the dams that have seemed to have been breached following George Floyd, all of the ways, all of a sudden, all the newsrooms, the New York Times announced today that we're going to capitalize the letter B in Black. And I remember, I tweeted about this when I first became a journalist. It was literally, okay, not literally, it wasn't beaten out of me, but you could not do that. Every time you capitalize B, the copy desk would change it back. Your editors would talk to you about, we don't capitalize B. You could not get that type of respect. And you just learned to stop capitalizing it. So to see the sea change has been really amazing. But what you've also seen is something I haven't seen before, which are all of these Black journalists, very prominent Black journalists, and also journalists who don't have as much protection, speaking out about the inherent bias in newsroom and coverage, and that objectivity has always been a fallacy. What's always been important is that our coverage is as accurate as it can be and that it's fair. And we're not trying to pretend that we're objective about, the police shouldn't be killing us and that we have a personal stake in the stories. But the myth has been that white reporters haven't had a personal stake in the stories, but clearly they have. When white journalists have ignored school segregation, it's because they have a personal stake in it, because school segregation benefits their kids. When white journalists have again and again taken the word of police, when police say, oh, this black guy deserved to die because he reached for my gun, or, I was scared for my life. White journalists took that at face value. That's a bias. That's a bias based on your interactions with police being they respect your rights and they just don't kill you for any reason. So I think we are in a period where all of these so-called norms are being exposed and challenged. And I think that our profession will be better for it. All my answers won't be that long. Sorry.
No, it's cool. That's what we came to hear.
Are we gonna drink this bourbon or what? Because I brought mine. Okay.
I got mine. I got mine here. Look, this is a tough issue, y'all. So we're gonna get through it.
I know, right? He asked me. I wasn't gonna do this, but
because I realized I don't think I ever had a conversation with you where whiskey wasn't involved, and I didn't want this to be the precedent. But when you were talking, I just had to think. I was like, wow, like, what is Ida B. Wells, your Twitter namesake? Like, how would she have objectively covered lynchings in the 19th century, or Martin Delaney from Pittsburgh covering abolition, slavery? I mean, like, what
exactly.
is
Can you imagine?
I can't.
Trying to ask a black man during legal slavery to be objective in covering an institution that was enslaving 99% of his fellow countrymen, of asking Ida B. Wells, a black woman born into slavery who started in covering lynching because her the man for whom she was his child's godparent was lynched, and saying, we gotta be objective in covering why these white people are stringing up black people and castrating them and cutting off their knuckles. Like you can't imagine that. And they
probably were objective. That's probably why the lynchings lasted for so long, right?
Well, her coverage was actually clearly far more objective than the coverage in the white media, which was simply taking the line of white vigilantes and saying that black people were deserving of their lynching. So it's the same way that we feel when we're covering police killings. It's not to say that we don't investigate and find the facts, because that is our job, is to find the facts. But to tell us you shouldn't objectively feel that unarmed citizens or citizens period shouldn't be killed by the state without consequence is ridiculous. And that's a standard that even white journalists don't always adhere to, right? Like when you're covering the president, white journalists are not objective about believing you should follow the Constitution, that you shouldn't be a corrupt president. We're not neutral in those positions. When a white journalist covers child protective services and exposes, that a child got killed because someone wasn't doing their job, that's not neutral. They're not writing about this because they don't care what the outcome is. They're writing about these things because they believe that they're wrong. And we got into journalism to hold powerful people accountable. These are not neutral positions. But when it comes to black folks, we're expected somehow to be neutral. And I just think it's great that we're calling all that shit out right now.
And even in terms of what gets covered and what doesn't get covered, right? I mean, like, I'm old enough to remember when gentrification was not taken seriously as an issue to be covered by any press until it became a crisis, right? Until when people were getting evicted and getting priced out. And I couldn't help but have to wonder if all these years, if the reason why gentrification wasn't being covered, especially in mainstream newspapers, was because white journalists themselves might have been gentrifiers, right? Like you're telling on yourself, right? And
yeah,
is this the kind of,
don't see it as a problem, right? Like if you're the beneficiary of the system, you don't necessarily see the system as being problematic. This was, to my point about school segregation.
Right.
Some years ago, I gave a speech to the Education Writers Association, and I said, we have been derelict as education writers and not writing about the largest driver of school inequality in our nation, which is school segregation. And why might that be? Because most schools reporters are white women, and white women make the educational decisions for their children. So
Right.
are you really, as a white female journalist with children who are in the public schools, going to be challenging a system that allows your child to get access to the best public schools in the district? No, that's not objective, because objectively school segregation was the story and it was not being covered. So this is the beauty of being Black. I always say, like, no one in America understands this country better than we do.
Absolutely.
And probably in Native people as well, right? Because the only way we have survived is we have had to study and understand this country and not be able to look at this country with rose-tinted glasses. That's how Black folks called Donald Trump, right? We were
Right.
all of us saying, every Black journalist I knew was like, this is about racism. And yet our white colleagues were convinced it had to be something else. Well, no one's really arguing in that anymore. So the sense that they're objective is a luxury of being a white journalist in white newsrooms in a white dominated society. And we don't have that luxury.
And until it affects them, right? Because another corollary is climate change, where I remember, again, for years, scientists were adamant about, or science writers anyway, were adamant about covering these things objectively in newspapers. Even to this day, media outlets to this day still give a microphone or give ink to people who are skeptical about climate change until it affects their backyards. And I remember, James Hansen was one of the, main scientists who was like crying holy hell about climate change. And they didn't like him because he was passionate, right? And you're supposed to be dispassionate. Now you got scientists out there like the Million Man March, they out there marching Black Lives Matter and everything, talking about climate justice. We needed that 30 years ago. But let me kind of hit a little bit closer to home. New York Times recently published an op-ed from Senator Tom Cotton. It was called "Send in the Troops," in which literally the point of this was like, we need to sick the military on these protesters in reference to the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests. You and your colleagues at the New York Times, you called them out for saying like this is reckless, right? Like publishing something like this could put our lives in danger. You particularly, Nikole, you always get death threats. I can't even laugh about this. Like there are people who are like out for you, and then like to see this op-ed get published, like, just to have a kind of sober, somber moment. But like how did that make you feel personally, and why was it so important for you and your colleagues to speak out about that?
I mean, I was outraged, one as a Black person, but also as an American citizen, and as a journalist. And I was outraged that you would give over one of the most important journalistic platforms in the world to a man who was calling to use our military to put down protests, which is, if you believe anything about this country, it's the linchpin of a democratic society, is the right to protest your government. And then journalistically, I was outraged because there was no fact checking. There was no ability to push back on, he was writing things that our own reporters that were contrary to the reporting of our own journalists, and that our own journalists had disproven. So there were lots of reasons that I thought it was very irresponsible. And as a Black woman, understanding the way that law enforcement has been deployed, the long history of violent resistance that has been suppressed by the federal government, state and local government, I just was deeply, deeply troubled that we would give platform to such an argument at a time when many of us had, there's Black journalists out there covering these protests. There's our community members, our family members who were being put in danger by that. And it's not that I didn't believe a news organization should air those views of a very prominent senator. Of course it should. But you air those views in a news article, where you can fact check the claims, where you can contextualize the claims, where you help Americans understand what's being called for. But you don't just allow someone the megaphone of the Times. The megaphone of the Times is an extremely powerful megaphone, and it should never be used to take away or to call for the taking away of the constitutional rights of our citizens.
And I don't want to say this is being devil's advocate, but let me just say, you probably heard the pushback from people out there who said, look, Nikole, you all did a whole 1619 project. You just put out a whole essay arguing for reparations. Why shouldn't the New York Times also give space for somebody like Tom Cotton, or whatever his name, Tom Cotton, to also say his perspective?
His last name would be Cotton.
Right.
So one, that's completely disingenuous. What we did was journalism, and we had a rigorous editorial process, rigorous fact-checking process. We're journalists producing journalism. And to even, try to put what we did with the 1619 project on par with that Tom Cotton editorial is frankly insulting. It's not the same thing. But again, I'm not arguing that Tom Cotton's views should not have been aired in the New York Times. Matter of fact, I would argue the opposite. Of course they should. When a sitting senator who has that much power, who has the president's ear, makes that argument, it is critical that we cover it. But we cover that as a news story. We do not just say, hey, write whatever you want, and we're going to give you the pages of our editorial page, and we're not going to fact check, and we're not going to push back on what you're arguing. That's two different things. So I don't think it's an apt comparison. And, people love to attack the 1619 project, and that's all good.
All you got to do is flash that Pulitzer. I hate it.
If I actually had one in real life, it's just, you don't actually, you get a certificate when you win for commentary. You don't get a medal.
Oh, we didn't know that.
Only public service actually gets the medallion.
Oh no.
But I still have it.
I guess we know what our next campaign will be for that. Let's one last question, because we got a bunch of questions coming in from the audience and I want to get them in. But since we're talking about 1619 project, I couldn't help but to observe that around this same time, you had people like Ava DuVernay, who was putting out movies like Selma and the Central Park 5 project, Casey Lemons with her Harriet Tubman movie. All of you all, and I'm including you in the 1619 project, all of you were these Black women who were doing this attempt at correcting the historical account, right? And reframing the history and centering the actual people who needed to be at the center, quite frankly, Black people. And for that, like, all of you just kind of got pounced on by historians, saying, you didn't know what you were talking about, you're getting the history wrong, blah, blah, blah. I don't need to recount to you, but what they were saying. And by the way, I need to add in that Nikole was actually offered, she is now a fellow with the Society of American Historians. So we need to point that out. But how much of this do you think is kind of owed to this idea that white men feel like they need to be the exclusive narrators of history? If you were a white man and you offered the 1619 project, do you think you would have gotten the same kind of scrutiny that you've gotten now? Yeah,
so one, to be clear, there was always a small number of historians who came out against the project. Several historians, including historians from Harvard and Princeton, wrote for the project. As you mentioned, I was named a fellow of the American Society of Historians. So clearly it's not the bulk of historians who felt that way. But I think what we can judge is that small group of historians got an inordinate amount of attention for attacking the project, as they did with Ava's Selma. And I think that does speak to, you have had these gatekeepers who feel that they have the exclusive right to shape the narrative of American history. The way we kind of tend to think about history is history is just the facts, and there's no bias in the way that history is presented, but that's clearly not true. Historians choose what they want to study. History is not just about facts, but the interpretation of those facts. Something similar happened, of course, when Annette Gordon-Reed was coming out saying that Thomas Jefferson had fathered children with Sally Hemings. There was, they tried to take her down over that, and they said it just wasn't true. And now that's accepted, that this is historical fact. So I wasn't surprised that there was a very vicious response to a project in the New York Times that was putting Black people at the center, that was arguing that slavery is foundational to the United States. There have been a long track record of white historians really trying to downplay the role of slavery, to try to downplay how foundational slavery was to both capitalism and our ideas of freedom. And we've seen this new crop of mostly Black historians, but other historians who have spent 20 years pushing back and redefining that narrative. So to have a Black woman like me, who on top of like, I'm a Black woman, also very outspoken, look and present a certain way, to be making this argument, I think some folks kind of lost their minds. And I actually have taken it, in some ways it was really hard, because I know how hard that I and everyone else on this project worked on the 1619 project, and to see kind of the glee that other publications had promoting this idea that the project was being discredited, even though it wasn't, was hard, but not in the least surprising. Someone like me is not supposed to be having an influence on how this country sees America. But I have, and this project has, and I'm tremendously proud of it.
Great. I have some questions coming in, but I think I need a little bit more time distilling them. Also, my computer is about to die, so I just, Thina just came through with the clutch. She came through with my charger. Let's talk about family. You and I are family people, and you've taken the brave step of actually inserting your family into a lot of what you write about. Like you wrote about like the very difficult conversation or decision that you and your family had to make about like what kind of school to put your daughter in. How does that kind of impact or add to the pressures and burdens of you as a journalist, especially as someone who's under such a spotlight? My real question is just like, how do you do it and still like like go to sleep at night and get a full night's rest, you know?
It's definitely a double-edged sword, because I think by personalizing some of my work, particularly the work about school segregation, I think it's what really allowed people to connect and see this issue not as abstract. It gave my reporting a moral force that I think is necessary to get people to acknowledge their own hypocrisy, particularly liberal folks. But what that comes with then is, when you put yourself out there, is you also invite a level of scrutiny that you don't have when you're much more kind of faceless journalist. And that's been really tough. People, are digging through, trying to find things that I wrote when I was in college. I've received threats on my house. Someone tried to do an investigation on my husband. Luckily,
what? Roger, what?
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, yeah, you definitely picked the wrong one. This is like the most straight arrow guy you met, and we there's nothing really to find. But I do realize that by personalizing some of my work, I think it has made my work more effective, but it also has invited a level of intensity and personal animus, that and how I engage on Twitter, that has really made me a target of the right in ways that I guess I didn't expect, and that are really hard to deal with.
Cool. And shout out to Faraji. Husband of the year, that's my dude. Shout out to him. So there's a question that's coming in, I believe from Laura. She's asking, this is a question I get a lot. I work at a white majority media institution, as you do. And her question is, because white people, these are her words, because white people are always late or too busy being objective and being racist. Should should Black people or Black journalists focus on creating their own news organizations or new organizations and systems rather than changing the existing? Basically, should we, instead of fighting from the inside, should we just start our own? I'm sure you've gotten this question a lot, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think we have to do both. I absolutely wish we had a strong Black press, particularly around investigative reporting. And this is off the record, y'all, all 751 of y'all. But, my dream is to one day birth such an institution. The problem has been, of course, that the Black press, like every other Black institution, is undercapitalized, doesn't get the type of economic support to be able to hire the best Black talent. And if you're going to do something like that, you have to be able to pay Black folks what they can get at other organizations. You can't ask Black people who already have no wealth, who are graduating college with high student debt, to sacrifice their livelihood and ability to take care of their families to write for the Black press. And that's unfortunately the circumstance, or else you're having to do, really superficial work. So I absolutely hope that we can, maybe even ride this momentum of this moment to find the type of funding to produce our own hard-hitting Black press. But I also know that it's important that we're also in these institutions. To produce something like the 1619 Project at the New York Times, that means something. There is a power to that I don't think you would get from really any other news organization, Black or white. And we can't just cede that ground, right? Like we can't cede the most prominent news organizations and not be in there fighting to tell our stories, because they're going to be reporting regardless. So I think it is up to us to do both of those things, and to fight for our representation across the media.
So a question from Jennifer. She really enjoyed What Is Old. She calls it a powerful and important argument. She says it's also a beautiful piece of writing and also feels so lyrically written. And she's interested about the process of writing that.
So I said I wasn't planning on writing this now, and I wasn't. I pitched that piece probably the Tuesday, and I had to turn a draft in. No, maybe I pitched it that Monday, and I had to turn a draft in within 4 days. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And when I pitched the piece, I just said I'm going to write like 2,000 words. Like I just, it really was. I mean, this is why I feel so blessed at my job every day, because I do the work that's on my heart to do. I do I was sitting at home and I was like, oh my God, like we just can't be talking about police violence. We have to take this moment and demand more. And I can have that sense and then have the megaphone of the New York Times to actually make that argument. So I told my editor I just wanted to write something like 2,000 words, just inserting reparations into the conversation. But then, of course, so when I told her that,
2,000 words.
Yeah, no. So she immediately doubled the word count on the budget, because she already knows I probably haven't written anything that was 2,000 words in at least 7 years. And I just sat down, and this is the beauty of having thought about something and studied something for a really long time. Like it was all there. And so even though I wasn't planning on writing it, I had all these arguments in my head that I've been thinking about for a long time. And I just sat down. It was grueling. It was like 3 days of 12 hours days, just writing what was on my heart and mind to write. And I turned the draft in. I told my editor I was going to get her the draft by Thursday, but I couldn't make it. And I think I got it to her Saturday morning. And when I sent it to her, I was like, I'm sorry, this is a really shitty draft, and it's 4 times as long as what I told you it was going to be. And the next day she texted me back and was like, this is not shitty at all. And I'm actually amazed that you pulled it off. It was pretty much we did multiple kind of refinements, but it was pretty much in the shape that it was in when it published, which is not always the case. But this was just one of those pieces that I had already written half of it in my head just from thinking and reading and thinking about this over the course of years. So I appreciate that you thought it was well done, because I've never, from pitch to close was like less than 2 weeks. I've never pitched or closed a magazine piece that was that long, that had that much history and fact checking to do in that short of a period of time. But the moment called for it. And writing pieces like this is like as close to freedom as I think I can ever feel in this country. So I felt free, even though it was hard. I felt free when I was writing it.
Well, I am glad that I am not alone in telling my editor that I'm going to turn in something at 800 words and then giving her 3,000 words.
I feel like 800 words is like my first paragraph. I don't even know how to write like that anymore. So
just clearing my throat. Yeah. We just setting the table at 800 words. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because if you read the piece, I think it's about 2,000 words in, and I say, okay, now we finally arrived to the point of this essay. And I wrote that because I knew, I was like, damn girl, you've been writing for like a whole day and you still haven't gotten to the point of the essay, which is reparations. So literally like, I'm telling my editor, I know I haven't got here yet. I'm telling the reader, I know I haven't gotten here yet, but I had to say this. And this is kind of the beauty of transitioning from being like a straight news reporter to an essayist, is the ability to kind of have that conversation in your writing and to be, you're not writing from a distance now, you're like in it. And I have found that even though I had a very traditional journalistic career, I was a newspaper reporter most of my life, that I love now doing like the deeply reported essay, but that allows you to do some things with language and do things with the way you're telling your story that you can't do as a kind of straight news reporter.
What, I don't know if you heard Emery in the background.
Hey.
Yeah. maybe we'll bring him in for a cameo later. He's being fed.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Okay. So a poignant question from Mike Harrington, somebody who I guess follows you on Twitter a lot and sees the hateration that you get. But he's saying, as a Black person, seeing the tragedy in our communities every morning has worn him down. Mm. And as you just said, you're in it. You're in the thick of it. He has a simple question: how do you take care of yourself? Besides bourbon.
Yeah, it's funny because so last year was probably like the hardest year. The 1619 project was the hardest thing I ever wrote, and then so writing it was extremely taxing. I was drinking way too much. I was eating way too much. And then the attacks that came after was even like more taxing. And I wasn't taking care of myself. And I love that Black people, it's usually a Black woman who asks me that question, but every time I would give a talk, that would be a question I would get. Like Black folks were always really concerned about how was I caring for myself? Because of course, Black people know that this work is hard, and having to be kind of enveloped in this all the time, not just because you're Black, but you're also writing about this and researching it is really hard. But I kind of made the commitment when we had to go into quarantine for the COVID-19 that I was going to like get my shit together, that if anything good was going to come out of having to be locked down in Brooklyn, it was going to be that I was going to like care for myself. And one of the things Ta-Nehisi always said to me is like, we got to be here. Like, we need you here to be writing and fighting for our folks. And like, you can't be here if you're not taking care of yourself. So, the way that I've been taking care of myself, you see my skin is looking all fabulous and dewy. I've been like eating well. I've been exercising every day. I drank only once a week. I did this for Brentin just because he asked me, but normally I only drink on Saturdays. And really trying to use this moment to center myself and make sure that not just physically, but mentally, I can keep doing this work because it's really hard. You know this, Brentin, like, this work is really hard, and it's hard just being Black, but never kind of getting an escape. I don't write about frivolous things. I don't, write about pop culture, the next, great song. That work is important, but that's not what I write about. And I've really been trying to do self-care. I always thought that self-care was silly. Like, who has time to be thinking about that type of thing? We need to be out here with our swords out, trying to make something better for our folks. And my grandmother working in a cotton field didn't have time for self-care. So how am I going to sit up here and think about that? But I've realized that it actually is really, really critical, and it's critical so that we can actually be here to keep fighting these battles. So appreciate the question.
We have a question. I'm not even going to try to say this name, but hopefully when you hear the question, you'll acknowledge, you'll know it's you. But they're saying that they, after the success of the 1619 project, basically they're asking, when you first brought that idea to the newsroom, was there resistance, and how did you get buy-in, especially for such a monumental task?
Yeah, so everyone assumes I would have had to fight a lot of battles to bring the 1619 project into the world. And, that would be an educated thing to think, but it just wasn't true. I work for really great people at the magazine, and there's not been a single thing, literally not a single thing that I've wanted to do that I haven't been allowed to do and haven't been given full support. And I'll say that I would be lying if I said that the New York Times is an easy place for Black folks to work. But when I was being recruited to come to the Times, I met with Dean Baquet, and I made it very clear I didn't think I was Timesian, that I was the type of person that the Times would really want, and that I wasn't actually, the Times is, most journalists dream about working at the Times. I just wanted to do the work that I thought was important. And if that was never at the Times, it was just never at the Times. And Dean told me that I was, New York Times material, and that I would get to do the work that I wanted to do, that I would always get the support to do that. And 100% that's been the case. So when I pitched the 1619 project, my direct editor immediately said, I think that's a great idea, let's do it. And when I pitched it to Jake Silverstein, the editor-in-chief of the magazine, he also immediately said, let's do it. And actually had bigger ambitions than even my original pitch. So I can say I'm really lucky in that way. But I also can say that clearly that's not necessarily the experience of other folks.
Cool. And we got a question from Anna Knopf. You were just talking about how taxing it is to be a Black journalist, especially in this space today. She's asking, how do we encourage more rising Black and journalists of color, to pursue careers in journalism and stay for the long haul, given all of the institutional hurdles and emotional labor we just discussed in our newsrooms? Yeah,
so you name the profession where you're not going to face this. It doesn't exist, right? Like being a Black person trying to work in spaces that are predominantly white is going to come with the same struggles no matter where you're working. But at least I know that I feel like every day I do a job that I know is important, that matters, that's a mission. So I feel like my work is actually making a difference. With that said, it's going to be a struggle, and people who know me know that I was nearly forced out of the industry myself. And there were times when I just didn't think I would ever be able to make it and do the type of reporting that I thought was important. But it's absolutely critical that we're here. The very first newspaper, Black newspaper in this country, the Freedom's Journal, their motto was, we wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. And that's why we have to, we have to be in these newsrooms, because people are going to either write our story or ignore our stories. And if we're not there to tell them correctly, they'll continue to write our stories to take away our humanity. So there's a lots of jobs you can have, and a lot of them are going to be hard as a Black person. But this is the type of job where every day, I think that you're doing a mission and working in service of your people. And I can't imagine for myself doing anything else.
So this question, I try to avoid this question, but it has gotten more votes. It's been voted to the top of the question. So there's no way around it. So Seattle, we about to put you on blast. So Menka Varghese, she says, although the PNW, I don't know what the PNW is, but although the PNW likes to see itself as a progressive enclave of the country, the Pacific Northwest, I should have known that. I'm an East Coast dude, so that's why. But you're coming out of Portland. That's where you started. Another place that sees itself as uber progressive.
That's the place that nearly drove me out of journalism. So. Well,
there you go. And she's saying, the Pacific Northwest likes to see itself as a progressive enclave in the country. Yet the lack of representation of journalists and reporters of colors in mainstream journalism, such as at the Seattle Times, is troubling. What suggestions would you have to push this to the center of the agenda of racial justice for the city of Seattle? But this is the most popular question, so I had to put it out there.
I mean, I don't know how to answer that, and I don't think. Yeah, the Pacific Northwest is progressive because no Black people out there, so they're progressive when it comes to trees. Definitely progressive when it comes to gay and women's rights, but when it comes to like race, they're just as bad as anywhere else, if not worse, because there's not even enough Black folks for them to realize how problematic they are. But I don't know. I don't feel like asking an outsider how you force your community to reckon with what they are is going to be that useful. If I knew how to make white people do the things that I felt they would do, I would be out of a career because I wouldn't have shit else to write about. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry, and I'm mad at y'all for voting that question up because I can't fix racism. Like, I just write about what happens and propose things that we should do better, but I don't have the answers.
But going back to Portland, where you said you almost were forced out, or almost was forced out, say someone gave you the keys to the Oregonian or the newspaper or whatever, and what kind of institutional changes would you like to see in a paper like that to make sure that the Nikole Hannah-Jones who's sitting there in the wings is not also going to be discouraged out of the industry?
Yeah, all any journalist wants is to be respected and believed and trusted, and to have editors who value the stories and the insight that you bring. All I've ever wanted was, I have ideas, I have a way of seeing stories, and I wanted those editors to support that. That shouldn't be a difficult thing. You hire people for what they bring and the unique insight and skills that they bring. So the difference between Nikole Hannah-Jones, who worked at the Oregonian, who couldn't get on the front page of the Oregonian, but can get on the cover of the New York Times. The difference is people who trusted me to do the work that I always could do. I'm better than I was back then, of course, because I'm older and I've been doing it longer now. But I was also not working at the New York Times. So I was good enough to tell these stories, to be on the front page, to do important work. And I didn't have editors who thought those stories were important and who valued what I had to bring. Every journalist of color, and journalist period, who feels like they have to leave journalism, it's almost always because they can't do the type of reporting and journalism that they got into this to do. We get into journalism because we want to make a difference, because we think this work is important. And if you can't do that, then you question, why are you here? So that fix would have been very easy. One, hire actual people of color Portland was the whitest major city in the country. Portland was whiter than Salt Lake City. So it wouldn't even have been hard to have a newsroom that matched the demographics of the city. That shit would have been easy. And they couldn't even do that. And then the journalists of color they hired, they didn't allow to do the work that gave those journalists of color a sense of value and respect. So that would have been easy. But that's the advice I give to every newsroom, every single newsroom, mainstream newsroom in this country that struggles to keep its talent of color. It's because that talent does not feel respected, their ideas aren't respected, and they are not allowed to do the work that they got into journalism to do.
Cool. I want to
I got to plug in too, Brentin.
Okay.
All right. But I got my cord right here. I'm prepared. Okay. This working from home is crazy, right? Like we're just on a whole different level now.
I'm juggling so many different things. It ain't even funny. I've learned to multitask, and if you got ADD like me, that's like torture on the brain. But I'm getting through it. I want to come back. To your essay. I meant to ask you this earlier, but I'm gonna buy some time for myself while I distill some of these other questions. You talk in your essay, What is Old, about, you reference the USA as this miraculous country. And, you know, I know that there's like people out there who think like you hate America or you hate white people, but like, you know, anyone who's like listened to the 1619 podcast and has heard like you talk about the patriotism that existed within your own family, with your father and the deference, not the deference, but the honor that you give to America because of Black people who fought for it and who shed blood for it. They know that like you don't hate America, but can you kind of talk about like this kind of nuanced and complicated feelings you have about America and its independence, especially as we approach the 4th of July?
Yeah. You know, I found the critiques that the 1619 Project is an American hating project and that I hate America amazing, because my essay for the 1619 Project is the most patriotic thing I've ever written. And in fact, I shocked myself by writing it. This is, you know, the only way that you can believe that the 1619 Project is anti-American is if you don't think Black people are fully American. Because as I say in the project, in my piece, Black people have believed in this country with a faith it did not deserve. Black people have taken the majestic ideas upon which we were founded and fought generation after generation to make them true. So how could I hate a country that we built? How can I hate a country that is the only place me and all my ancestors going back as far as I can count have ever known? But what we want is a country that actually reflects its ideals. We want a country that actually believes and manifests universal equality, that treats all citizens and non-citizens with humanity and justice. That's the America that I believe in, not this idealized version of America that believes in some exceptionalism that never existed, that forces us to ignore what happened to Indigenous people, that forces us to ignore what happened to Black people. But to understand that this is truly a multiracial project, with some of us fighting much harder than others to make those ideals true. But we are a miraculous country. We have made it so. Black people, Native people, and significant numbers of white people who have really tried to form a multiracial democracy, that have tried to live up to these ideals that we all are created equal, have made this country miraculous, but we still fail every day. And I choose to believe in the America we could be, but that we haven't reached yet. And they want to believe in this idea of America as if it were true, even though it wasn't. And I don't find any use for that. Patriotism isn't about wearing a flag pin on your jacket or flying a flag outside. Patriotism is about believing in your fellow citizens, of respecting them, of believing that we should take care of our people in this country, and believing that we should actually own up and atone for our sins and try to make things right.
Not only was America the greatest, Nikole, but we need to make it great again. We need to bring the greatness back.
Yeah, well,
that's what I'm being told.
some of us are still waiting for that greatness, and
I never saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, this is why I always say that Black folks are the most inconvenient people in this country, because the only reason we're here is because we weren't great. Like every other group, even if they suffered, even if, you're talking about Chinese immigrants before the Chinese Exclusion Act, they opted in. We didn't opt into this shit. We were forced here. And when you see us, we're the constant reminder of the hypocrisy at our founding. And that's why, we're so reviled in this country, because we're that dark shadow that casts see, this is my camera keeps shaking because my daughter's next to me playing Roblox, and I'm about to make you get off if you can't stop shaking my table. Hey, baby.
Well, both of our kids just
exactly. Came. Except yours is an actual baby, so we can excuse that. I have a 10-year-old. So Black people force us to confront who we really are as a country, but at the same time, Black people have given this country hope that we can be who we want to imagine we could be. Like if Black people ever got equality, we'd be an amazing country, because Black people fight for everybody. It's just, I wish sometimes everybody would fight for us.
Exactly.
We have a question? No?
We do. Somebody heard that you said something about 1619 Project being a book. Is that true?
Absolutely.
They did hear you? Okay.
Yeah, so we're actually turning the 1619 Project into a series of books. They're going to be books ranging from young readers to young adults to an adult version of the book. And we're working on the adult version of the book right now, which will have additional essays by some of your favorites, additional pieces of short fiction. And I guess I got to do something with this reparations essay I just wrote to make it feel fresh for the book as well.
Get it across the finish line.
Yeah, look out for that.
And then we have a question from Shane. He wants to know what your thoughts are on the role that technology could play in reimagining the way that we educate our children.
So I'm probably not going to give you the answer that you want on that, because what our kids need, and I'll speak specifically to Black kids, is the same thing that rich white folks want for their kids, which is they want a really good in-person teacher and a really good in-person curriculum. Technology is not going to save our kids. And if there's anything that this pandemic has taught us, is that online learning is not the business, okay? What you want...
Tina is snapping and snapping right now.
I just gave up. I'm like, I just had to give up. Our kids need... Education is more than about just acquiring a certain amount of knowledge that allows you to do well on a test. Education is about building citizens. It is about teaching our children about the world. It is about sitting in a classroom with folks who are not like you and engaging in the process of learning and discovery. And it, every time I hear someone who says, well, if we just get technology into these segregated schools, there's a reason people are paying $100,000 a year to go to Harvard and sit in a classroom with their professor. They're not paying all that money to get online curriculum delivered to them in their homes. Our kids need great teachers who can foster great discussion and teach our children about life and learning and discovery. And where technology can enhance that, amen. But I'm not interested in a Chromebook for our kids. I want a quality teacher and a quality curriculum.
I'm getting a question about Bill Moe. He wants to hear your thoughts about policing. I'm trying to think, what is the most objective journalistic way that I can interpret the question. What does the reporting bear out? What do the facts bear out about how policing happens in America with respect to Black people, and even how imprisonment, and how, you know, what do the facts bear out, and does the reporting bear out? Does it support the call for defunding the police or even abolishing the police or jails?
So we're the most carceral nation in the world. So I feel like that answers your question.
Mic drop.
Right. Like, if no other country requires the amount of incarceration that we require, if countries, then we have to ask, why are we the outlier? And in a country built on chattel slavery, what's different about America from a lot of our European counterparts is the slavery was practiced right here on these lands in our country, not exported to another island somewhere. If we're that much of an outlier, then we have to question why that is. And I think the statistic I saw is Black people in America account for 10% of all the people incarcerated in the whole world, just Black people. So clearly, we know that we don't need to incarcerate that many of our citizens. We know that other countries are able to handle crime without incarcerating people that way. We look at the rate of police killings. In my essay on reparations, I talk about how during the height of lynching, 2 Black people were killed on average every week for 90 years. We're killing 5 Black people a week. Police are killing 5 Black people a week in this country. So I guess I don't know the spirit in which that question was asked, but I don't know how one looks at the facts and believe that you need to be locking up 1 out of 3 all young Black men, that it's okay for citizens to be brutalized by police regularly, the type of surveillance. I mean, we know the history, particularly in the South and the Northeast, that the slave patrols morphed directly into police departments, and that the type of policing Black communities get is not the type of policing white communities get. When people say defund the police, what I hear are people saying, we want the policing that y'all get. We want policing that actually serves. We want, if somebody murders my cousin, I want the police, but I don't want the police there pushing every Black man that they see up against the wall, stopping and harassing citizens to the point where in my neighborhood, and I have, you know, a master's degree, a Pulitzer, I'm not calling the police unless somebody's about to die. That's a problem. So we clearly need to do something to reform our police. And so much of what we're asking police to do is enforce boundaries, enforce segregation, deal with mental health issues, deal with poverty issues, when we could be spending all of that money to actually help people with their mental health and help people get out of poverty. So I hope that was a sincere question. But the first thing you need to ask is, why do we incarcerate more than China, than Russia, than all of these countries that we consider to be authoritarian? We're locking up more citizens. And if you think that that's right in a democracy, maybe you should reconsider why that is.
And I just got a question in over the transom from Thina, sticking with this policing issue from Thina. She, you know, talking about police in schools, we're seeing a lot of cities taking, you know, they're taking police out of schools. You know, again, what does the reporting, actually, let me ask like this, because you're doing research on school segregation. Can you kind of talk about the impact of or I guess the intersection between school segregation and police in schools? Is there an intersection there? Or are we seeing more police in schools with larger Black and Latino populations? And also, like, why is it important that we're seeing police coming out of schools right now?
Yes, I'm assuming that's a rhetorical question, Brentin, because you know good and well, it doesn't matter how many white schools get shot up, they don't get the type of policing in their schools that Black and brown schools, particularly high poverty schools, regularly get. What is the purpose of a school? I spent, year before last, I spent a year in one of the poorest high schools in Detroit. And this was a school that had, like many poor Black schools, no social worker, but they had an entire team of security, and they actually paid outside security to come into the school. So what message does that send to the kids in the school about what's important and what they're actually in school for? We have to stop thinking so little of our kids. If school is to be a place of learning and discovery, or a school to be a jail and a system of social control, for so many of our Black kids, schools are a system of control. It's a place to guard them until their parents get off of work. And police send a very clear message. Nobody wants to go into a school and see a school full of law enforcement. You are criminalizing kids from a young age. You are sending kids a message from a young age that this is normal to be treated like this. And now I will also say, kids also want to feel safe. And I would be lying if I didn't say that some of the kids say that they want security in the school because security makes them feel safe, particularly if they live in rough neighborhoods. But they don't want actual police with guns who are arresting students in their school. So we have to be able to manage this in different ways. In New York City, for instance, the police in the schools are not controlled by the school district. And I have talked to principals where police have arrested students that were doing something that the principal asked them to do. And when the principal has tried to intervene, the principal actually has no control. That is highly problematic, that you are allowing police in the schools that are not answerable to the school district. We went from having police as resource officers to police as disciplinarians, to instead of teachers and principals handling discipline, they simply call the police and the police arrest the kids. We wouldn't tolerate this for white kids. And you hate to say that because white people should not be our gauge, but in a white supremacist country, or a country founded on white supremacy, how we treat white kids is how we should be looking to treat Black kids. And if there's a disparity there, then we understand why. I think police should be removed from school. Let me just say that. I don't think we should have actual law enforcement in our schools. There's a way to handle safety and discipline without further criminalizing our kids.
Cool. I want to do a time check with our hosts and organizers. So I see we're getting close to the 7:15 mark. Are we all good? Well, until I hear from those people, let me.
Hey. Why don't you want to do one more question and then we can call it a day, or are we feeling done?
Let's do one more question. Nikole, what a lot of people don't know is, besides being a mother in your own family, and even before you founded the Ida B. Wells investigative reporting organization, you already were a mentor. I mean, mentor, that sounds like such a weak ass term for what you actually were. I mean, you actually were a mother. You actually are a mother to a lot of Black journalists who've been coming in under the industry. That's while you did a 1619 project. That's while you've done all this other stuff. Why is it? Talk about why it's been so important in your personal and professional mission to help other Black journalists coming up in this industry.
So my motto is to try to be for other folks what I needed when I tried to make it. I remember having older Black journalists who really looked out for me, who helped guide my career, who pointed out opportunities to me, and how important that was, because we don't always have that in our newsrooms. And what you quickly learn is news, as in all businesses, it's not just about your talent and your work ethic. So much is about who you know and who's there to kind of clear the path and guide you. For so many, Black folks, we don't come from professional families. We don't come from families that can tell you, oh, let me call such and such and they can get you an internship at this place, or let me call such and such who I went to college with, who can help you get a foot in the door. So when some of us get our feet in the door, I've always felt it's an obligation to try to pull as many people behind you as you can to demystify this process, to be that person that some of us had and some of us didn't. So as much as I can, I mean, that's why I helped co-found the IDB Wealth Society. It's why I do try to mentor. I give my number out to like far many young folks when I go to colleges and give talks or when I meet folks at NABJ. But I just think it's critical. You should never be, as a Black person, as a marginalized person of any type, satisfied to be one of the only ones in your position. If you're one of the only ones and you failed, it should be all of our mission to try to open those doors for as many other people like us and marginalized folks as we can. And that's just what I tried to do.
I'm gonna call church on that. Y'all want to bring the benediction in? Seattle Town Hall.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. It's been incredibly informative and enjoyable to listen to, and the work that you're both doing is important and powerful, and we're absolutely honored to host the both of you. And I want to thank Grist for helping us make this happen and for partnering with us on this great event. And if our audience members feel so inclined, feel free to give Town Hall a donation. I hope you'll consider visiting grist.org as well and giving those folks a donation, subscribing to their work, and of course keeping up with the great work
waiting for you.
Nikole and Brentin are putting out. All right, thank you so much, everybody. That concludes our program. There's more Town Hall stuff coming up later in this week, so feel free to subscribe to our Crowdcast channel. And with that, good night. Thank you again, Nikole. Thank you, Brentin. And
Thank you. Thank you all.